Okay, so I'm going to talk about superhero science. But first off, if we're talking superheroes, every superhero has an origin story. So I thought I'd better share my origin story because my ultimate goal here is to become a superhero using science, because that's basically why I'm doing what I'm doing. So this is me. This is my origin story, an insatiably curious child that ended up turning what was quite a destructive curiosity of pulling things apart to find out how they work into an actual career. So I sort of embraced the geekiness and nerdiness of trying to pull everything apart. It was a chaotic childhood, I have to say. As an only child, anything that was within reach, I would pull apart. So whether it was Dad's turntable needle, I kind of wanted to find out how this needle managed to produce music. That didn't go down so well. It turns out those things are really expensive. To trying to find out how Barbie worked as well. So, you know, we'd end up with an arm over here and a head over here. Luckily, I didn't go into medicine. I went into material science. So I did a chemistry degree, first of all, because that, for me, felt like the language of science. That sort of, for me, underpinned how stuff worked. But I wasn't quite content with that. So I ended up doing a master's in analytical chemistry, which allowed me to find out a little bit more about how things work and why they work the way they work. And then I ended up somehow doing a PhD in materials chemistry, and this is where I started to cross over from just science into science and engineering, so bridging the gap between just the poking and prodding of stuff and finding useful applications for it. So I've also done a teaching qualification. This is basically my parents' wall. It's just photos from their living room wall. So I've done a teaching qualification beyond that, but that's basically my life now. So I do research, and I'm a lecturer, and I do loads of science communication as well. I still remember Sir Mark Walport once saying that science is not finished until it's communicated, and I think that's really important. So the fact that we're all here today, I think, means that we all want to play a part in that journey, and I think that's really good. So let's all network together and see how we can help each other. So this is my current identity, but I kind of feel like I want to be a superhero. So I'm thinking, well, how do I use my own superpowers? I feel like I'm making a small contribution through the research that I do. So my research is based on capturing sunlight energy and using it to split water molecules to make hydrogen and oxygen. We can collect the hydrogen and we can burn that as a fuel. It releases 3 times more energy than methane, and it's effectively recombining with oxygen to reform water. So you start with water and you end with water, and it's a beautiful sort of sustainable cycle where the water is acting as a vehicle for solar energy. The water can't capture the sunlight itself, though, so it needs a bit of help. And this is where this intermediate comes in, and this is the bit that I work on. This is titanium dioxide. Now, left to its own devices, it's great. It can capture a little bit of UV light coming from the sun. But we want to maximise the amount that we're able to capture. So by adding in nanoparticle impurities of gold and silver, my weird superpower is to tweak the electronic properties of this material so that we can capture a greater proportion of the solar spectrum. So this is ultimately what I'm trying to do, make hydrogen so that we can burn it and release loads and loads of energy, but that energy has come from the sun. So if I imagine myself as a superhero, I'm sort of gathering energy, throwing it into my system and creating a way that we can create a solar fuel. So for me, I think solar energy is a pretty good bet. There's a really lovely factoid whereby the amount of energy reaching the Earth in 1 hour from the sun is enough to meet current global energy demands for an entire year. Now, it's obviously quite difficult to capture a lot of that, but if we can start to make steps to capture more than what we're doing already, we could be onto a winner. We can start to find a viable alternative to the fossil fuels that are in a finite supply and damaging the environment, not to mention the fact that they're incredibly expensive. So this is my plan. I am going to have world domination through the medium of your homes and your cars. So it's not as exciting as you would think, but you know, it's for good and not for evil. So that's my superpower, but brilliantly, science, technology, engineering and maths are actually starting to look at ways where we can get real-life superpowers. So I'm talking the kind of things that we all think about. When you think about a superhero, maybe you have a particular superpower that you would like. What I'm going to do is share my favourite bits of current scientific research that are going one step to making those superpowers a reality. So, you guys ready for this? Then I'll begin. So the first thing I think would be really awesome to have as a superpower is the power of invisibility. You know the feeling. It's Sunday, you go into your fridge, you realise you're out of bacon. You do the kind of shameful pyjama-clad creep to the corner shop. But then you're going to see somebody you work with coming in the other direction. If you could flick a switch and just become invisible, just hide, that would be amazing. So this is a legitimate superpower-ish. You know, the invisible woman has it. But how can we achieve it? We can start to look to nature. We can start to think about camouflaging ourselves rather than becoming invisible. We're all ill, aren't we, today? This is great. Sorry, apologies for the tiny coughs. So we can start to look at nature and we can start to think about how we can blend into our surroundings. That could be one potential way to do that. So we've got a bug that looks like a leaf. We've got something climbing up a tree that you can't even see. It's just hidden within the bark. We have the cute factor of the two owls nestled into the tree there. But it's not quite invisibility, because what we are after is true invisibility. We want to be indistinguishable within certain surroundings. And the only way that we can do that is to understand how we can manipulate light. Because what you want to do is find materials that are effectively going to kind of move light around or interact with light in a certain way. So one way that you can try this at home, because this is the best kind of science to try at home, is to use these things. So these are sodium polyacrylate beads. They're florist's beads, and they start off as these teeny tiny glassy balls. They're really, really small. But sodium polyacrylate is what's known as a hydrogel. So it's able to absorb loads and loads of water and accommodate it within these long chains of polymer molecules. And in doing so, it swells up. So it ends up being about 1.5 centimetres in diameter. And these really bouncy balls, because they've changed properties entirely now, full of water, they're actually entirely indistinguishable from the water that they've soaked up. And it's partly because of the fact that they've absorbed so much water that light interacts with it in exactly the same way. So when they're in the beaker, you can't actually see them. They're completely invisible. But when you take them out, you can see them. Well, that's great, except what we're really after, let's face it, is this. Who doesn't want an invisibility cloak like in Harry Potter? I certainly want one. Let's just think about the mischief that I'd get up to. Now, this is potentially possible. And again, it's all about manipulating light. But rather than finding materials that can react to light in the same way, that can interact with light in the same way, what we want to do is find a material that can bend light around an object. Now this sounds terrifying and kind of futuristic, but it is possible. Scientists have been able to do this using materials that can basically divert light around an object. But there are a couple of challenges here so far. So the wavelength of light that we want to be working with is within the visible spectrum, the light that we see with. And at the moment, we're working with much greater wavelengths of light. But there are some other challenges as well, because the item that's being concealed will still cast a shadow. But it gets even creepier, because the materials that we're using at the moment, they're not yet see-through either. So if you really wanted to wear a cloak of invisibility, but you wanted to see where you were going, you'd have to cut out 2 eye holes. So this would make you a pair of floating eyes, which I think is way more terrifying than anything that you could achieve in an invisibility cloak. So quite frankly, it's pretty awesome. But they are starting to develop materials that can do this. So they found a material, it's these gold nanobricks, and they have these little antennae that act as small mirrors that can just divert light around an object. So the challenge is to try and make this material potentially see-through in one direction, a bit more flexible, and find a way where we're not going to be casting shadows. But it's not just for kind of bad things. You can use it for good things as well, particularly in things like energy applications when you want to be directing light into a certain focal point. So I think that's pretty cool as a superpower. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is climate control. Now, this may not sound like a superpower for you guys. For me, though, if I am able to harness my own kind of thermal regulation in any situation, I can avoid things like this. So how is this a superpower? Well, let me introduce you to the first gratuitous picture of Chris Evans. The Human Torch is one example of something that can withstand a huge extreme of heat. So it's basically on fire, but he is completely protected. Are there materials that can possibly help us, protect us from such extremes of heat? Well, yes, because some materials can have multiple properties. So we can look at something like the SPA beads that we've already mentioned. They're full of water, and water has a very high specific heat capacity. So it takes ages to warm up, and that can protect you from extremes of heat. But it's not quite futuristic enough. You don't want to be walking around covered in these gel beads. But what you might want to do is incorporate a really cool material into your everyday wear. This stuff is Aerogel. And Aerogel has a lovely story behind it. It's basically a glass-like material. It can be made of other things as well. And it's like a jelly, but the jelly has had the water component removed and replaced with air. Now, if you try and do this with a normal jelly, the problem is that as the water evaporates off, the structure collapses in on itself. It shrinks down. What an aerogel does is it's been dried in a very specific way. So it means that all of the tiny holes within this material stay in shape. And so as they fill up with air, air is a really poor conductor of heat. And so heat just cannot transfer through this very effectively at all. So it is the ultimate insulator. But the great thing is that it was developed as a bet. As all of the best scientific discoveries come about, this was done as a bet. It was a competition between a couple of people to see whether they could create a material like this. And they did, through supercritical drying. But then they had no use for it. Until a few decades later, when NASA realized that they needed a material that could insulate really, really well. And then they came across this work. And so they did a bit more development, and they came up with commercially available aerogel. Now, it's quite brittle, but it can be used for things like heat tiles, and it can even be broken up a little bit and incorporated into fabrics. So you can get pyrogel blankets that are incredibly insulating, and they can be used in a range of applications, potentially even to kind of keep me warm on a very cold day and cool on a very hot day as well. So that is one superpower that I can manage. Now, you may have noticed from the fact that you can only see my head beyond this podium, that I'm quite small. I am a nanochemist, quite literally, as well as professionally. And so, for me, it's quite difficult to kind of feel powerful sometimes, no less when I was loving the fact that I was quite good at basketball in school, but mostly got mocked because of the fact that I'm quite tiny. So for me, I would love to be able to harness true power. I want to be the Muggsy Bogues of the Psychon basketball world. And I want to be able to jump higher and run further. So a little bit, I suppose, like Ant-Man. Ant-Man can certainly pack a punch. But is it possible? Can something be both tiny and mighty? Potentially, yes. And we can start to look at material science again to see whether it can help us achieve this. So I'm pretty tiny, but if I can get a bit of help to move faster and further with very little energy, then I can start to harness some of that power. And there are scientists working on something very similar using carbon fibres. They're creating artificial muscle using carbon fibre. So they have filled these carbon fibres with paraffin, and they've twisted them around themselves to add a little bit more sort of tension into this structure. Now what happens is, as they heat these fibres up, the paraffin inside rapidly expands, pulling the ends of the carbon nanotubes closer together. So it's kind of working a little bit like our muscles do, where the tissues are shortening in a ratchet system in our own muscles. This is what's happening here. So they've created artificial muscle. But the great thing about this is that this stuff is way more reactive than human muscle. In fact, the reaction times are 200 times faster, and they take very little energy. Just a little bit of heat can get them contracting really, really quickly. So you can start to incorporate these things into things like suits, like wearable tech. You could put on a pair of leggings and go running, and suddenly I could be leaping like a gazelle and not like Phoebe Buffet just by using these awesome bits of artificial muscle and a bit of wearable tech. From a real-life perspective, they're actually starting to incorporate these into things like prosthetics as well. So they're giving people enhanced mobility by using this kind of material, which I think is pretty awesome. But it gets even cooler because you can even start to create things like artificial hearts, materials that are able to actually pump things around the body, very much like a human heart. And so all of this stuff starts off as science fiction, but is actually starting to tend toward science fact very, very quickly. What about toughness? Now, one of the superpowers that we see a lot from a lot of superheroes is the fact that they can withstand anything. They've got bits of glass and brick flying at them. We don't have that luxury because we are quite soft, squishy people. So how can we start to harness the powers of the Hulk? One way that you can start to achieve this could be by looking at one of the simplest and most fun science experiments that we can do. It's very much a do try this at home situation. If you have not played with corn flour mixed with water for some time, I urge you to go home and do that tonight. Put Strictly on, get the corn flour out, grab a wooden spoon, add some water to it. You'll notice that after a certain point, the consistency of it starts to change. It gets a little bit weird, and so as you try and stir, you're feeling a lot of resistance. It's because the corn flour has got to its non-Newtonian phase. So a non-Newtonian material is like the naughty teenager of the material world. It sort of disobeys the normal rules of physics and mechanics. It kind of thickens up, at least corn flour does in this case, as you apply a force to it. So it can, if you apply a force hard enough, briefly behave like a solid. And that is pretty cool. But as soon as you stop applying a force, it will go back to behaving like a liquid. So what can we do with this? Well, a company has actually commercialized this non-Newtonian power of certain materials, and it's created a material called D3O. It was a startup company. They set up in Brighton, and they started making this orange goo. And they've started to incorporate this orange goo into a range of things. The reason being that with a non-Newtonian material like this, when an impact is applied to it, when a force is applied very quickly over a short space of time, the molecules lock together and are able to dissipate the energy of that impact through the material very, very quickly, which means that something as basic as corn flour and water could be used for things like bulletproof armour. It's already being incorporated into all kinds of things. I have a pair of ballet shoes with this stuff in. I have a pair of running shoes with this stuff in. I'm just slowly replacing everything in my life with a non-Newtonian version of it. But it's even in things like beanie hats. So for those of you that go snowboarding or skiing, you can now get really cool looking beanie hats that have this D3O foam incorporated within them, so that if you fall over and you hurt yourself, if you hit your head, the material will take on a huge amount of the impact of your fall, protecting you from that fall. So I think it's really awesome that something as basic as corn flour and water could be used to save lives. But it's not the only material that can add a whole amount of strength with very little to wear. It had to be mentioned at some point, I'm sorry, but graphene. Graphene is amazing. Now, I know they say that graphene is the answer to everything in science. My fiance and I we ran a pub quiz at Cheltenham Science Festival once, where for one round, the answer to all of the questions was graphene. Because it really does feel like in science, that is what we always say. But graphene is incredibly tough, incredibly strong, and it can, sorry, there goes the voice again, withstand a huge amount of strength. So it could be used as a very thin shield to protect people in a sort of bulletproof armour way as well. Thanks to the fact that my voice is slightly failing and you guys have way more exciting things to do. I'm going to move on through this section very quickly, but if you want to find out about Spider Goat, find me later. So the thing I wanted to wrap up with really was this. We've had lots of superhero battles. We had Batman versus Superman, we had Civil War, which was Cap versus Iron Man. But what's the ultimate superhero? Well, I reckon from these two battles, we had two clear winners. And the great thing about it is that they're not people that have been in a horrific accident. They've not been bitten by a spider or been exposed to radiation. They are ultimately just awesome scientists and engineers with a lot of money. So in our case, you know, I don't have Stark Industries, but I have, you know, a little grant funding. And that's awesome, because this means that I am closer to being a superhero than I actually realise. Now, the great thing that unites these two is that they have combined all of these things to make some kind of power suit. So we could do that too with some of the science that we have. It probably wouldn't be as shabby as this. It's not very autumn-winter 1718, I admit. But all of these things are incorporating loads and loads of tech into one thing. And I think this is a really lovely example, not just of the materials being used as composites, but lots of different things coming together. So in each of these suits, there are loads of different things going on. You can have something like graphene embedded within a fabric. You can have all of these composite materials going on. Tony Stark's suit could be a sort of shaped memory metal. You can even have graphene faceplates for the vanity aspect of your suit, because it's see-through but incredibly strong. So I have to say that the cool thing about this is that we're bringing everything together. And this is an awesome example of what we should be doing. People are making these things. People are making real-life super suits. But none of these companies are working on their own. All of these companies are working with many different disciplines. They're working with the public. They're working with policymakers. They're working with government departments. So composite materials is one example of how things are better together. But I have to say that as scientists, the best thing that we can do is work together as well. Cross your disciplines. Work with people in your marketing departments, in your outreach departments. We need to work together to make the best out of science. So I say, let's all get involved, make the most of today, and thank you so much for letting me brighten your day today, hopefully. Thanks a lot.